Good evening. Good evening. On behalf, get here. Good evening. On behalf of the Acton 250 Committee, welcome to the fourth in a series of lectures intended to provide a context for the events of April 19th, 1775. May I see the hands of those who are attending their first lecture in the series here tonight? Wonderful. Welcome. Welcome back then to so many of you who are repeat attendees. We could not have better timed this evening's speaker, John L. Bell, for early April, 2 weeks out from Patriots' Day, any year, but also for 1 year out to the culmination of our countdown to April 19th, 1775. The Acton 250 Committee, under a charge from the Select Board, has now been at work for a year and is pleased to have brought you lectures providing an understanding of the traditional mode of life of our rural area and the building pressures of being an outpost of an empire at its most powerful, or seemingly so. Amy Cole, who's with us this evening, maybe she'll wave her hand, has developed a tour of Acton Center, which she will again host on April 6th and 12th. Please note that links to all earlier lectures are online at Acton 250 Events. A series of summer tours of Acton historic structures from the period will appear there soon. Please check the website regularly. A wide array of merchandise, which you may see later tonight right up here, may be ordered online there too. And we have a special offer. It is possible to buy an Acton 250 pin this evening for a small sum of $5, correct? Correct. I would be remiss if I did not take this opportunity to encourage everyone to be aware of and join in the traditional Acton's Patriots' Days activities coming up this year on April 14th and 15th. What many call the alarm ride will take place late afternoon on Sunday the 14th with a rider alerting residents that the regulars are on the march, riding from the Morrison Farm on Concord Road to the Isaac Davis House on Hayward Road, and on to the Faulkner House in South Acton, where activities have been going on all afternoon. Please check with Ann Forbes. Where is she now? Right back, way back with her hand up, representing Ironwork Farm for more information. She will direct you most likely to the table where Miss Maddox is leaving, where have been placed small takeaway pieces of information about both of the key days, the 14th and the 15th. Very early on the 15th, the Acton Minutemen and Boy Scout troops will assemble at and march from the Isaac Davis House to Acton Center and on to the bridge in Concord. One of the best ways to feel the spirit of 75 is to join in behind them and complete some portion of that march. Noted historian Joseph J. Ellis has described the 18th century as a country we need to visit. We heard Bob Allison about the crucial year 1773, ending with the destruction of the tea, the catalyst for all that was and is to follow. Acton's own Mary Fuhrer then focused us closer to home on the social context of rural towns as understood through primary sources and resources. Professor Edelman clarified the central role of newspapers in passing along news from afar, even if it seemed a bit akin to plagiarism to our AB students that evening. Our countdown to April 19th, 1775 continues as Boston awaits an imperial response to the events of last December. It is my great pleasure to introduce John L. Bell, author of The Road to Concord, How 4 Stolen Cannon Ignited the Revolutionary War, who also maintains the Boston1775.net website, dedicated to a deeper understanding of the start of the American Revolution in New England. His many other historical writings, which you will find available up here at the end of the evening, will surely serve as a basis for sharing a much broader grasp of how it felt, excuse me, to be a witness to the unfolding events of 1774. A Q&A session will follow his talk, and you will have an opportunity to purchase his book. May I hear a warm welcome for John L. Bell.
Thank you, Pam, and thank you to Bob and the Acton 250 committee. Thank you to Bill and the Acton Historical Society, and thank you to whoever brought in all the Acton high school students. Thank you very much. I understand that, as Pam said, this talk is about the committee's longer conversation about what brought men from Acton to Concord on April 19th, 1775, and particularly about what, besides bayonets, took those men from Acton, made them willing to be up at the front of the march down to the North Bridge. I'm going to be focusing, as my book does, mainly on the military preparations, and you'll hear from other people, I believe, about the politics and other aspects of that. But let's start with Acton. According to the most recent Massachusetts census in 1765, Acton was home to 100 families that comprised 611 people, about half of whom were age 16 or younger. It was not the smallest town in Middlesex County, but it was on the smaller side. Concord, which was its parent town, was about 2.5 times larger, and Concord was also one of the county seats with a county court for Middlesex County. So if we want to figure out what people in Acton were thinking about in 1774, we have to look at the political environment of rural Massachusetts. And let's go back to Massachusetts' Constitution. Starting in 1692, after the Glorious Revolution in Britain, the government in London, guided by Parliament, appointed the governor of Massachusetts. Most other British colonies worked the same way. Colonial government, therefore, was part of a mix of top-down and bottom-up power. And it may be better, instead of saying bottom-up, maybe middle-up, because, of course, it was the white men of property who got to vote. The top-down powers exercised by the crown, the imperial government with Parliament in charge, the crown appointed the governor. The crown appointed the lieutenant governor. The royal governor appointed many of the local officials, usually for life, such as the judges and the justices of the peace and the sheriffs. The crown controlled the military, both the army and the Royal Navy. The crown controlled the customs service, which was the primary way that the crown got to pay for its bills. But in New England, there's also a bottom-up authority which started with people, men, voting in the town meetings. And the town meetings elected their selectmen, as they do here, and the other town officials each year. The town meetings, you had to have a higher property requirement in order to vote for your representative to the provincial legislature, the Massachusetts General Court. And then each year, the outgoing General Court would elect the council, which was a smaller body of very rich men who were to advise the governor and approve some of his decisions. So ultimately, and the council also had to vote on the laws. So that was sort of like the Senate, except it was the Senate as if it were being elected by the outgoing House. Ultimately, both those chambers, the Assembly or House and the council, got their authority from below through these various levels. There were some areas where top-down and bottom-up authority came into conflict. For instance, the governor could veto bills that came out of the legislature. The Privy Council in London could veto bills, and there was no way to override a veto. The militia was a very important institution in the middle of this dynamic. It was the local self-defense emergency force. It was distinct from the regular military, which answered to the crown, i.e. it wasn't the army, it wasn't the navy, it was a local institution. It embodied local self-governance and self-defense. And militia service was required for almost all white men between ages 16 and 60. In some ways, the militia was top down. The governor was the official commander of the militia, and he appointed the colonels and generals. But really, the militia was a bottom-up institution because companies elected their own officers, their own captains, lieutenants, and sergeants. And the militia was an avenue in your town because you served with other people from your town. It was a way of rising in society, of proving that you were had leadership potential. If your neighbors thought that you could be a sergeant, you could be a lieutenant, that said something about you. Also, another way the militia was a bottom-up institution is if the militia didn't want to turn out, there was no force to make it turn out. Nobody could force them to do anything. In 1747, there was something in Boston called the Knowles riots over impressment by the Royal Navy. In 1765, there were the Stamp Act riots in Boston. And both times, the governor went to his council, his advisors, and said, I want to call out the militia. And the council, who were local men, said, you know those people out rioting in the streets? Those are the militia. In 1765, with the Stamp Act, London started to strengthen its control over Massachusetts and the other colonies. In 1767, Parliament prepared to grant salaries to top appointees, which would insulate them from local popular pressure. They were previously paid by the local legislature, and if the local legislature didn't like what they were doing, they would take some time about voting their salaries. Well, that pressure was going to be gone now because the crown was going to be paying the salary from above. The new laws in 1767 also beefed up the customs service so that they could collect taxes more easily. And then came, as you've heard, the Boston Tea Party in December 1773, and the imperial government really cracked down with the new coercive acts. And the man in charge of enforcing those acts was General Thomas Gage. He was the commander-in-chief of the entire British Army in North America. He had lived in America for decades. He had married an American woman. In 1774, the king appointed him royal governor of Massachusetts because he assured the king that he would be able to bring this rebellious colony under control. And Gage arrived in Boston in May 1774, bringing a couple more regiments with him, a couple of army regiments. There hadn't been any regiments in the center of Boston since just after the Boston Massacre. They were there to patrol the town, to protect other royal officials. They were there to help keep the port closed because another of these coercive acts from Parliament was that Boston could no longer trade with any other colony in the British Empire. Also, Gage, his instructions were to take the legislature, the Massachusetts General Court, and instead of convening them in Boston, where they usually met, he would convene them out in Salem. So, all that prestige, all that business would go away from Boston, so there. Parliament tried to formally limit Massachusetts' bottom-up self-government with what was called the Massachusetts Government Act. This basically was an attempt to rewrite Massachusetts' traditional constitution. From now on, this new law said, town meetings, you could only have them once a year in March to choose your selectmen and other officials, and after that you needed approval from the governor before you had a town meeting. Back in 1768, there had been a province-wide convention in Boston. Well, that wasn't going to be allowed anymore. No more province-wide gatherings. The council, as I said early on, the council had been elected from the bottom. Well, from now on, the council is going to be appointed from the top with something called writs of mandamus. And so this new council was called either the Mandamus Council or by locals, the Newfangled Council. They didn't like it. The Massachusetts Government Act arrived in Massachusetts in August. General Gage started swearing in his new councilors chosen in London, in Salem, And the people of Massachusetts didn't like it. In their eyes, the Crown had encroached on every area of popular government. So Massachusetts' elected politicians responded with resistance to the coercive acts in the summer of 1774. The General Court sent men to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. In response to that vote, the governor dissolved the legislature. The town meetings, they had heard about this new law coming up with and the new rules about town meetings, no new town meetings. They said, okay, we're not going to have any new town meetings. We're just going to adjourn our meeting to another month from now, and then we'll meet, and it will be the same, legally the same meeting. The Massachusetts Government Act, as I said, it addressed town meetings, it addressed province-wide meetings. It didn't say anything about county meetings because there had never been any county meetings. So they started having county conventions, moving from the west of Massachusetts. Berkshire County, out on the western end of the state in July 1774, even before this law arrived, they were starting to have county meetings. In Worcester County in August 6th at Mary Stern's Tavern in Worcester. At the end of August, the Hampshire County Convention. So on, we know about what happened at, we know very little about what happened at the meetings way out in the western part of the states because they didn't keep notes very well. They didn't publish notes. But in Worcester, they began to have a formal protest against this new Massachusetts Government Act. And then there was an even more populist resistance to the new law on county court days. Berkshire County Court was to meet in Great Barrington on August 16th. And instead of meeting, hundreds of men showed companies and ringed the courthouse and refused to let any of the judges and justices go in to do their business. Again, we don't have a lot of sources on this, but you can see, and you can see also from the design of this marker out in Great Barrington, that it's actually a relatively new marker. This is not something that had gotten into the history until relatively recently. But this was a popular resistance, people putting their bodies in front of the most authoritative people, authoritative men in their county and saying, no, you're not going to act under the Massachusetts Government Act. The same thing happened in Hampshire County on August 30th. The crowds were also going to some of the houses of these newfangled counselors and intimidating them into saying they would resign or saying that they would leave town. Meanwhile, Gage was having trouble in Salem. On August 25th, that town met to choose delegates for an Essex County Convention. County convention there too. And he tried to stop that meeting, he failed, and he realized that Salem was not going to be any more cooperative than Boston. So he decided to move back to Boston where most of his troops were. Middlesex County held a convention on August 30th and 31st. And that meeting was held in Concord, and Acton sent 3 delegates. And that meeting adopted resolutions like this. Resolved that it is our opinion that these late acts, if quietly submitted to, will annihilate the last vestiges of liberty in this province, and therefore we must be justified by God and the world in never submitting to them. Resolved that it is the opinion of this body that the present act respecting the government of the province of Massachusetts Bay is an artful, deep-laid plan of oppression and despotism that requires great skill and wisdom to counteract. And the votes adopting those resolutions and others were 146-4. From Boston, Gage looked out at the countryside and he saw that things were getting bad. And he decided to minimize the threat that the countryside could pose to him. And so he decided to act against this site, the Provincial Powder House in Charlestown, now Somerville. It held gunpowder owned by the province and by town militia companies. And he didn't want to leave gunpowder out in this incendiary countryside. A general in the militia told Gage that the towns had removed all of their powder, but the rest that was in this tower belonged to the province. So legally, actually, it was Gage's to do it because he was the commander of the militia. This was the militia gunpowder. He could say, yes, bring it into Boston. And he decided to do that. The general ordered a mission on September 1st. Before dawn, 280 soldiers marched from Boston Common to the Long Wharf. They clambered into boats. Navy sailors rowed those men up around Boston to the Mystic River. They landed on a dock on a loyalist farm, and they marched to the Powder House. They arrived at this tower before dawn on the 1st of September, and they waited until twilight grew, until it became more light, because you don't want to take lanterns into a gunpowder storage house. They even took off their boots because they would have nails in their boots, and you don't want to strike your nails on the stone floor of a gunpowder house. And very shortly, they moved 250 half barrels of powder into 8 wagons. 20 soldiers proceeded on to Cambridge. They met the sheriff of Middlesex County. He turned over the county militia artillery company's 2 small cannon. Some locals tried to stop them, but they couldn't get organized, and so soldiers moved all of this ordnance to Castle William, a fortified island in Boston Harbor. Thus, all of what seemed like all of Middlesex County militia's self-defense capability was being moved away from the people and into the hands of the British government, the Crown. That operation took fewer than 300 soldiers. It went smoothly. It met no real resistance. It was over by midday. Gage felt so confident about the new situation that he announced that there would be new elections for the legislature, that people could elect a new general court to meet in Salem. However, to the people, the removal of their powder and their cannon looked like a strike at their militia, a strike at one more branch of their self-government being encroached on. And what's more, rumors about what happened were even worse than reality. In Hartford, people heard at Cambridge, a high Tory had petitioned Gage for troops to protect him at his house, which Gage granted. A mob gathered and demanded of the militia general to renounce his Toryism, or whatever you term it. And after a short parley, the troop fired and killed some right out, a large number wounded. So there's a rumor that there was a second Boston massacre. And by the time the alarm reached Longmeadow, Massachusetts, the story was that the ships on the harbor of Boston and the army on the land side were also firing on the town. It was like the town was demolished. So people in the middle of Massachusetts were hearing that the entire town of Boston had been destroyed by the British military. And here's how a minister recorded the experience of a young Irish merchant named McNeil, who was traveling through Massachusetts on business and had reached the town of Shrewsbury. He went to bed without hearing anything, but about midnight, or perhaps 1 o'clock, he was suddenly waked up, somebody violently rapping up the landlord, telling the doleful story of how the powder was taken, 6 men killed, and all the people between there and Boston arming and marching down to the relief of their brethren at Boston. And within a quarter of an hour, he judges 50 men were collected in the tavern, though now deep at night, and equipping themselves and setting off posts every which way to the neighboring towns. The men set off as fast as they were equipped. In the morning, Mr. McNeil rode forward and passed through the hole at the very time of the convulsion. He said he never saw such a scene before. All along were armed men rushing forward, some on foot, some on horseback, at every house, women and children making cartridges, running bullets, making wallets, baking biscuit, crying and bemoaning, at the same time animating their husbands and sons to fight for their liberties, though not knowing whether they would ever see them again. All this in an activity corresponding with such emotions appeared all along the whole tract, about 40 miles from Shrewsbury to Boston. Now that scene should seem familiar, especially to folks who've grown up here, because that's how America remembers the Battle of Lexington and the alarm that led up to that battle at Concord in April 19th, 1775. That was the subject of innumerable 19th century prints like this one. But remember, McNeil was talking about his experience on September 2nd, 1774. He witnessed an armed uprising in central Massachusetts against the royal government of Great Britain more than 7 months before the Revolutionary War officially began. Men in rural Massachusetts were gathering in their militia companies and marching towards Cambridge. And here's how the radical Boston Gazette spun the story. The county of Middlesex took the alarm, and on Thursday evening began to collect in large bodies with their arms, provisions, and ammunition, determining by some means to give a check to the power which so openly threatened their destruction, and in such a clandestine manner robbed them of the means of their defense. And the Boston merchant John Andrews said they had an account at Marlborough of the powders being moved last Thursday night, yet they were down at Cambridge, which is 30 miles, by 8 o'clock Friday morning with a troop of horse and another afoot. At 8 o'clock, there were about 3,000 under their regular leaders on Cambridge Common and continually increasing. And when Andrews said regular leaders, that meant the militia officers. This was an organized militia mobilization. And as the crowd reached Cambridge, well, they began to hear about the real situation. There was no shooting, there had been no killing, Boston was not in flames. But they kept coming anyway, because they still saw that there was a political crisis that needed addressing. They advanced to Cambridge armed only with sticks, as they had left their firearms, etc., at some distance behind them, said the Boston Gazette. Towns in the western part of the province had intimidated many of the newfangled councillors into taking their seats. Well, now the people in Cambridge decided to do the same. They sent for the councillors, the 2 councillors who lived in town, and other officials to meet them on the common. The Cambridge Committee of Correspondence was worried about violence, about possible retaliation from General Gage in Boston. So they sat down with the leaders of the new arrivals and the new councillors, and both those men resigned in writing. And then they went out to the common and they resigned out loud to the whole crowd. The Cambridge Committee also sent for help from the Patriots in Boston. This is Dr. Joseph Warren, and he reported later to Samuel Adams, who was in Philadelphia, a billet was brought respecting me to take some step in order to prevent the people from coming to immediate acts of violence, as incredible numbers were in arms and lined the roads from Sudbury to Cambridge. So half a dozen leading Boston activists set out across the ferry. And Warren wrote, on our way, we met the Lieutenant Governor, Thomas Oliver. Lieutenant Governor Oliver, who was a man from Cambridge, he had made a deal with the leaders of this growing crowd. He would go into Boston, he would ask General Gage, whatever you do, don't send out soldiers, don't try to put this down by force. And if they would remain peaceful, he would try to make sure Gage's side remained peaceful. Warren said, we thought this precaution good, and proceeded to Cambridge. So all these upper-class gentlemen from Boston were coming out to calm the farmers, not to rile them up. Now, this is rather ironic, because for years, Dr. Warren and his colleagues in Boston had been trying to get the rest of Massachusetts to be as upset about the taxes and the soldiers in Boston and everything else as they were. And now they were trying to get the people outside of Boston to calm down and not be so upset. By the time the Boston Whigs arrived, the councillors were resigning, but the Bostonians went up front and tried to take charge, because they're Bostonians. One of them treated the gathering like a town meeting. The Boston Gazette said, a vote was called for to see if the body, the group, the gathering of people, was satisfied with the declarations and resignations, and passed in the affirmative, nem con, which was the Latin abbreviation for no dissenting votes. Completely unanimous vote. It was then moved to know whether this body would signify their abhorrence of mobs, riots, and the destructions of private property. And that passed in the affirmative, nem con. So like 4,000 men carrying sticks. Oh yes, we're totally against riots. The committees sat down in a tavern with the militia officers to figure out what to do next. They decided that the sheriff who had turned over the cannon to the army, he was just following orders that he had to do as a militia officer, orders from the general, so they couldn't legally get on him, in fact, but he had to apologize for sending out writs for court under the Massachusetts Government Act. So he apologized publicly. Another question was about Lieutenant Governor Thomas Oliver, who had just come back from Boston saying, I talked with General Gage, I did what you asked me, and they said, okay, would you resign from the council too? And he said, this wasn't part of the deal. I would consider resigning, but no, he was not going to resign. This seemed satisfactory to the committee, the leaders, the gentlemen. They were preparing to deliver it to the body, says the Boston Gazette, the thousands of men. But then something happened to inflame the people. 3 customs commissioners rode through Cambridge on their way back from Boston to Boston from Salem. They had been up in Salem with General Gage. They were moving back to Boston. These were the men who were in charge of collecting those unpopular taxes since 1767. Isaiah Thomas, the young printer of the Massachusetts Spy, recognized these commissioners who were headquartered in Boston. And one commissioner later reported, no insult or affront was offered to me until I came to where some people from Boston stood, who called to me, damn you, how do you like us now, you Tory son of a bitch? And the Boston Gazette said, the sight of that obnoxious person so inflamed the people that in a few minutes, above 160 horsemen were drawn up and proceeding in pursuit of him on the full gallop. Some of the committeemen convinced the locals to stop the chase, but a few continued to chase the commissioner across the bridge from Cambridge to Roxbury, all the way to the gates of Boston, which were guarded by British troops. Meanwhile, back on Cambridge Common, a rumor that soldiers were about to march out to Cambridge spread. The crowd sent light horsemen. They were starting to already think of themselves in military terms. Light horsemen is a military language. Out to scout the roads. And those men rode out and came back with the news that no, there were no soldiers on the way. But now the crowd was all riled up. And they were riled up about Lieutenant Governor Thomas Oliver. So even though their committee had agreed that Lieutenant Governor Thomas Oliver did not need to resign, well, they didn't believe in that. They didn't accept that anymore. So they all marched out to Thomas Oliver's house late in the afternoon. They caught him just as he was an intelligent man, preparing to get out of there and go back to Boston. Hundreds of men surrounded his house. Some of those men had now retrieved their guns. Oliver refused to cooperate. Soon men came closer. They were surrounding the house. They were peering in through the open windows. They were pounding on the glass. Oliver could hear his wife and young daughters and household servants crying. And all the leaders of this crowd were pleading with Oliver just to resign as the crowd demanded, because they did not feel that they could control these men. And finally, Lieutenant Governor Oliver took the resignation that was forced on him and wrote, "My house at Cambridge being surrounded by about 4,000 people, in compliance with their command, I sign my name, Thomas Oliver." Meanwhile, inside Boston, there were other rumors being spread. John Andrews, the merchant, wrote, "5 expresses have come down to Charlestown and here to acquaint us that between Sudbury and this, above 10,000 men are in arms and continually coming down from the country back. That their determination is to collect about 40 or 50,000 by night, which they are sure of accomplishing, when they intend to fling in about 15,000 by way of the neck, and more over the ferry, when once they get possession, to come in like locusts and rid the town of every soldier." So people in Boston were afraid that their town was going to be invaded by 40,000 country people. And there would be fighting in the streets. And only one force was strong enough to disperse that crowd around Thomas Oliver's house: the weather. Deacon John Tudor's diary for that day says, at 5 p.m. came on a hard thunder and lightning with a great shower, and the thousands of men headed home to their farms. But that confrontation on September 2nd had made clear that this was no longer a matter of Bostonians anymore. As Gage told his boss, the Secretary of State, Lord Dartmouth, on September 2nd, "Though I saw things were bad when I wrote from Salem, I found them much worse than I expected when I arrived here in Boston. Though the people are not held in high estimation by the troops, yet they are numerous, worked up to a fury. They are not a Boston rabble, but the freeholders and farmers of the country." For years, royal appointees had believed that a small faction of Boston malcontents was riling up the province. And they just wanted to peel off that layer of bad leaders, and everybody would be happy. By now, Gage realized that many more people of Massachusetts were angry. And in fact, the rural populace had become more radical than the Boston leaders, and they were no longer respecting the traditional authority of royal appointees. The authority of the royal government now stopped at the gates of Boston. General Gage had troops in Boston and at Castle William in the harbor. He had no power to compel obedience anywhere else in Massachusetts. In fact, New England was no longer inclined to respect his authority. The rural population, 90% of the population, because 90% of people were farmers, had adopted this idea that it was absolutely necessary to resist the Massachusetts Government Act, as those resolutions from the Middlesex County Convention said, is absolutely necessary to do this. When men massed in their militia companies, that was how the militia was supposed to respond in an emergency threatening the community. Not waiting for clear orders from any authority above, immediately just mobilizing under your local leaders for your local self-defense. And in fact, rural militias were still mobilizing in New England 3 days after the powder alarm, as the news, the original rumors rippled out through the countryside, and then it took a little while for the corrective rumors to come along. So Dr. Warren told Samuel Adams, the men from Hampshire County crowded into the county of Worcester with armed men, and both counties received the accounts of the quiet dispersion of the people of Middlesex with apparent regret, grudging them the glory of having done something important for their country without their assistance. In Pomfret, Connecticut, Israel Putnam heard about the Royal Artillery supposedly shelling Boston around 11 a.m. on Sunday. Remember, this all happened on Thursday and Friday. 11 a.m. on Saturday. He sent off letters to his counterparts in that colony's militia, and handbills repeating Putnam's alert arrived in New Haven on Sunday. And by Monday, September 5th, word of the trouble reached New York, and the commander of the British troops there wrote to General Gage asking if he needed help. And on Tuesday, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia received their first intimation of the bombardment of Boston, as John Adams wrote. So over that week, probably 20,000 New England militiamen mobilized, however briefly, even though this was, of course, before the telegraph, before any news could travel faster than a horse, and yet 20,000 armed men were ready to march. That afternoon, Gage canceled those elections. He decided that wasn't a good idea after all. Not that the towns paid any more attention to his orders. I'll come back to that. He also responded by increasing the defenses of Boston. The Royal Navy moved men of war around the town closer. Gage stationed cannon at the neck, pointing out at the very people he was supposed to govern, and he started to fortify the gate there. He was, on September 4th, he summoned the 10th and 52nd regiments from Quebec. On September 5th, he summoned all the troops he had in New York. Everybody, his forces in North America were going to be concentrated in Boston. There was supposed to be a Worcester County court session on September 6th. It didn't happen. The Worcester County Convention had requested the judges not meet, and militia companies turned out to support that request, which is to say, an observer counted 4,722 men around the Worcester courthouse, lining Main Street, demanding that every royal appointee promise not to act under the new laws. At one point, the organizers of Worcester feared that the troops would come out, but the court closing confirmed that General Gage simply did not have enough force to do that. Of course, General Gage, he was no fool, that situation looked dangerous to him. He warned Lord Dartmouth, his boss in the colonial office, the country people are exercising in arms in this province, Connecticut and Rhode Island, and getting magazines of arms and ammunition in the country, and such artillery as they can procure, good and bad. So he was giving a military warning to the government in London. Now, by artillery, Gage meant cannon. Massachusetts militia companies had a few small cannon that they trained on. General Gage's soldiers had taken the two back from the Middlesex County on September 1st, but most of the cannon in Massachusetts were along the coast, in Boston, or in batteries guarding the harbors, or belonging to merchants who would arm their ships in wartime. The Charlestown Battery, which is the blue circle above the red, it contained 5 cannon, 18-pounders, meaning that they could fire cannonballs that weighed 18 pounds. And by September 7th, the people had hauled all those cannon away. They were reportedly hidden on the Schoolhouse Hill in another part of town under what an 1845 historian termed stable dirt. The people in Dorchester followed Charlestown's example. On September 12th, Samuel Pierce of Dorchester recorded in his diary, "The great gun was removed from Preston's Point at the mouth of the Neponset River." Boston itself had 2 batteries in the north and south ends of the central harbor, and in 1770, those 2 fortifications contained 22 cannon between them. Now, the Royal Artillery was already using the South Battery, so the locals couldn't get into there. But the North Battery was still staffed by a militia company. Well, that looked a little dangerous to the ships in the harbor, which is where those cannon were pointed. So on the night of Wednesday, September 14th, sailors from the Royal Navy entered the North Battery from the water and spiked all the guns inside, so they couldn't be used. In addition, the Boston Postboy reported that the cannon in the batteries back of Governor's Island in Boston Harbor were removed by the general's order. So those actions kept the shipping channel and the mouth of the Charles River safe for the Royal Navy. But that wasn't all that happened on that night, September 14th. Boston also had two small gun houses or armories near the center of town. This is the builder's sketch of one of them. They were about the size, I think, of a two-car garage. And each of those had two small cannon on carriages made for battlefield use. These guns were used by the town's militia artillery company called the Train. The man in charge of the artillery of that company leaned toward the crown, but most of the men in the company were strong Whigs or patriots. General Gage did not want to lose control of those four field pieces, so he ordered a double guard on the new and old gun houses. But on the morning of September 15th, the troops found that there was an opening in the side of one of the gun houses, the old gun house, and the two small brass cannon inside were missing. Naturally, Gage put an even stronger guard in front of the new gun house, which already seemed quite secure because it was right next to Boston Common, and on Boston Common was the 4th Regiment of Foot in their tents. And the commander of the Train, the commander of this militia company, had the only key to that gun house. But even that situation didn't seem secure enough to General Gage, so on Friday, September 16th, he had Royal Artillery officers go get the gun house key, take a squad to this place, right in front of the British Army camp and take out the cannon, but when the squad opened the gun house, the guns were gone. All four of the Boston Train's brass cannon had vanished. And there were other conflicts over artillery inside Boston in September 1774. On September 20th, a boat carrying iron cannon out of Boston ran aground, and the Royal Navy was able to seize those weapons. At the end of the month, there was this big confrontation over the inventory of a hardware merchant named Joseph Scott, and the Royal Artillery enforced a sale and took away all his ordnance, and Scott went into hiding from the mob because somebody climbed up, broke his window, and emptied a bucket from the outhouse into his bedroom. That night, Dr. Joseph Warren went to General Gage to complain. The doctor asked, "What is the meaning that the general buys military stores? Why does the army need to buy all our cannons?" And General Gage reportedly replied, "The country people are armed and are collecting our cannon and military stores from all quarters, which could indicate nothing but their intention of attacking His Majesty's forces in the town. It is notorious that many cannon have been conveyed from thence, and arms are carried out openly by every man that goes out of Boston without molestation." That's how he saw the situation, reportedly. He tried to alert his superiors in London about how dangerous it was. On September 25th, the general wrote to the Secretary of War, Viscount Barrington, "The New England provinces, except part of New Hampshire, are, I may say, in arms, and the question is not whether you shall quell disturbances in Boston, but whether those provinces shall be conquered. From appearances, no people are more determined for a civil war, the whole country from hence to New York, armed, training, and providing military stores." But General Gage didn't tell his superiors how Bostonians had managed to sneak 4 brass cannon out of town under his own nose. That probably wouldn't have helped his standing in London. As it worked out, the ministers in London, when they read his letters, they thought he was overreacting, so they didn't send help. The people of Massachusetts, they went ahead with those elections that Gage had called off. And I understand Mary Fuhrer is going to talk to you more about the politics, but I'm going to keep following the weaponry. The new Massachusetts Assembly gathered in early October in Salem. General Gage said we should come. Here we are. They waited a day, and they decided, okay, we waited. We're going to form a shadow government, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. It met first in Salem, and then it adjourned to Concord to be a little bit further away from General Gage's reach. Now, a provincial Congress, that was basically like a province-wide convention. That was explicitly not allowed under the Massachusetts Government Act, but they were doing it anyway. And in fact, more towns sent delegates to the provincial Congress than sent delegates to a regular legal legislature. That was how committed towns were to taking back their government. And soon that Congress began to assume the powers of government. They took control of the taxes. They started to prepare them for the military. It reorganized the militia. It asked companies to basically purge loyalist officers and start more militia training. On October 25th, a Congress committee drew up a military budget that called for 20 field pieces and 4 mortars. And that committee, that Congress formed a committee of safety and supplies to make sure that these ordnance was collected. They voted in November to start collecting cannon out in the countryside. Now, this is about 2 months after the people of various towns began to grab all the cannon they could and move it out to the countryside. So really, what was happening was the committees started to catch up to a process that was already underway, a bottom-up process. Another action of the Provincial Congress was to urge towns to form companies of 50 privates at the least, who shall equip and hold themselves in readiness on the shortest notice. Back in August, the Worcester County Convention had expressed that as forming companies to be ready to act at a minute's warning. The Congress couldn't order towns to do that. It didn't have the legal authority to give orders. It could only suggest that. And many towns took up the suggestion. Those units would become known as minute companies, and the men enlisted them as Minutemen. One of the towns to create a minute company was Acton in November. Joining a minute company meant that you had to upgrade your equipment. You had to have everything you needed for militia service. You couldn't just say, well, I'll get a bayonet later. You had to have it. It meant extra training, which took time from your other work. The towns that created minute companies faced the question of whether to pay the militiamen for the extra time they were putting in. And different towns reached different decisions. Some town meetings decided not to pay the Minutemen at all. Others paid every militiaman the same amount per drill, but they knew that the Minutemen were drilling more often, so they were getting more. Acton made the decision to pay its minute company extra in January 1775. 60 minutes later, a Minuteman named Solomon Smith recalled, "We usually met twice a week for drill, and the town paid us 8 pence for every half day." Now, as we stand here, you know that when a Yankee town meeting decides to spend money, they're serious. And if they're spending something on military, they are deadly serious. In December, this arms race to control the artillery spread outside Massachusetts. The Rhode Island Assembly voted to remove almost all the guns from Fort George off Newport. 5 days later, the people of New London, Connecticut moved their cannon into the country. People started to wonder about New Hampshire, where Fort William and Mary guarded Portsmouth Harbor with cannon. Bostonians saw signs that a Royal Navy ship was about to go up north. And so Paul Revere, rode 60 miles on icy roads to warn the New Hampshire Patriots that this warship was supposedly on the way. Militiamen surrounded Fort William and Mary, overwhelming the captain and 6 soldiers inside. They seized most of the gunpowder in the storehouse. And then 2 days later, the 2 people from the First Continental Congress showed up, and they went back to the fort and took out all the cannon. General Gage realized that the Crown had now lost control of almost all of New England. The other governors were either powerless or on the Patriots' side. The London government was not going to send him any help. But to his credit, General Gage did not give up. He started an effort to infiltrate the Patriot movement in Massachusetts. On February 21st, 1775, the Committee of Safety and Supplies met in Charlestown, and they decided that they had enough cannon, they had collected enough and equipped enough, that they were going to start organizing artillery companies in their military force. And on that same February 21st, in the evening, according to his files, General Gage suddenly got a lot more information about the Patriots' military. There are in the country 38 field pieces and 19 companies of artillery. General Gage had made a deal for information with a new committee member, Dr. Benjamin Church, Jr. of Boston. We don't have an authentic picture of Dr. Church, so I'm showing a bit of a ciphered letter, a coded letter that he sent to a British Army officer later in 1775. Now, Church was nearly at the highest level of the Whig movement inside Boston. In fact, he was basically at the same level as Dr. Warren. And thanks to Church, General Gage now knew that most of the provincial Congress's guns were at Worcester. There were a few at Watertown, there were a few at Concord, and some were at Salem, including pieces of brass cannon. And Gage was looking for brass cannon, the brass cannon that were stolen from Boston on his watch. So the general made new plans. Back in early January, Gage had recruited Army officers capable of taking sketches of a country to contact his office. And Captain William Brown of the 52nd Regiment and Ensign Henry de Bernier of the 10th Regiment replied, on February 22nd, the day after receiving his first intelligence from Dr. Church, the day after, the general wrote out instructions for those two officers. They were to hike out into the Massachusetts countryside in civilian clothing as far as Worcester County, taking notes on roads, towns, passes, fords, and other geographic features. The two officers in disguise left Boston on February 23rd with an enlisted man as a servant. By midday, they got as far as Watertown, and during their dinner there, a black woman told Brown and de Bernier that she recognized them as officers of the Army. So the spies' cover was blown. But they understood that it was absolutely necessary to push on to Worcester. So they continued west. Meanwhile, General Gage received more information from Dr. Church, and in particular, the physician relayed, there are 8 field pieces in an old store or barn near the landing place at Salem. They are to be removed in a few days. The seizure of them would greatly disconcert their schemes. Did those weapons include the guns stolen out of the Boston gun houses? If they were, Gage had to act quickly. So Gage ordered an expedition to Salem. Late on Saturday, February 25th, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Leslie and 240 men sailed from Castle William in Boston Harbor. Their ship docked at Marblehead early on Sunday morning. The soldiers stayed below the decks until most of the people went into their meetings and churches. And then the troops disembarked and started to march through town toward Salem. Now, in fact, in Salem, there was a painter named David Mason who was working for the Committee of Safety, gathering cannon. He had collected about 12 old iron cannon, and he had them at a blacksmith shop in the north of the town, across the North River. The blacksmith was making carriages for them. Mason heard that the British soldiers were on their way, so he raced out of his meeting house up to the blacksmith shop and started to move the cannon to a wooded area about a mile away. And they also pulled up the drawbridge over the North River. Lieutenant Colonel Leslie and his men arrived, guided by local loyalists, and they could see the smithy they were supposed to search, but it was across the river. And the bridge was pulled up from the other side, and they couldn't get across. And there was some yelling, and there was some shoving, there were some attempts to grab boats. There was some attempts to scuttle boats so they couldn't be grabbed. And militia companies were gathering from nearby towns on the other side of the river. And after about 90 minutes of this standoff, with the sun going down, the minister of a nearby church negotiated a compromise. Mason, who by now knew that his cannon were safely removed, he would let down the bridge. Leslie pledged his honor he would not march above 30 rods beyond it and then immediately return, not looking for cannon nearby. And that's what happened. The 64th Regiment stepped across the channel, got as far as the orders said they were to go, turned around, came back, marched on their way back to Marblehead, and the militia companies marched behind them from a distance to make sure they went. And on March 3rd, a week later, the local Essex Gazette newspaper reported 27 pieces of cannon were removed out of this town in order to be out of the way of robbers. Meanwhile, Captain Brown and Ensign de Bernier, you remember them? They were out in central Massachusetts, and on Sunday they were in Worcester sketching out maps of the roads and taking careful notes on the cannon they had found in that town. And that evening, as they worked in their inn, 2 men came and told the tavern keepers that they knew that these 2 strangers were officers of the Army. So Brown and de Bernier left Worcester the next morning. And on their way out, a man came and rode beside them. And according to a local history from 1827, that man was Timothy Bigelow, leader of the Worcester resistance. Bigelow seems to have alerted patriots in Marlborough, the men's next stop. So the officers were kicked out of a safe house and had to trudge back to Boston through a snowstorm. But Gage still didn't give up. And around this time, he developed another intelligence source out in the Massachusetts countryside, somewhere around here. This person seems to have lived in Concord and communicated by letter. He or she wrote most of those letters to General Gage in terrible French, probably as a way to ensure that most people would never be able to read them. The spy's message on March 8th said, among other things, 4 brass cannon and 2 cohorns or mortars, so called by the peasantry, concealed at Mr. B, lately chose or appointed minute colonel, supposed to be deposited in his cellar. That was General Gage's intelligence. Well, the 4 brass cannon, those were the 4 guns from Boston. The Patriots had smuggled them out of town, hidden them for a while at a tavern in Dorchester, and then moved them out to Concord. Gage's spy reported on other iron cannon at the Concord courthouse, and more had just arrived from another town, possibly from Salem. The man in charge of those guns was Mr. B, lately appointed minute colonel. This was James Barrett, a 65-year-old farmer and a provincial Congress delegate. This is his house. Barrett himself kept an account of the military stores he was collecting at Concord. And that list is now at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, and it exactly matches what the spy was telling General Gage. There were 4 brass cannon, there were 10 iron cannon, there were 2 mortars. Barrett had neighbors storing other supplies for the Committee of Safety, musket cartridges, musket balls, flints, gunpowder, entrenching tools, medical chests, tents, tent poles, dishes, spoons, and 4 barrels of oatmeal. Gage ordered Captain Brown and Ensign de Bernier back out into the countryside. They marched out to Concord in disguise on March 20th, and they confirmed the same information as the local spy. Their iron cannon they kept in a house in town. The brass they had concealed in some place behind the town in a wood. On April 14th, General Gage received new orders from London, written on January 27th. That's how long it took for the orders to get across the ocean. Lord Dartmouth didn't merely authorize military action against the rebellion, he told the general that he had to act. The orders specified that the first and essential step would be to arrest the principal actors and abettors in the provincial Congress. But Gage didn't move to arrest anyone. He wasn't tracking John Hancock or Samuel Adams or any other patriots. Gage's intelligence files and his orders show that he was completely focused on cannon and on Concord. And I argue it was because he knew that was where those 4 stolen brass cannon were. Seizing those field pieces would require a march deep into hostile territory, 17 miles to Concord, another 2 miles across the North Bridge to Barrett's farm. But if that mission was successful, it would erase the embarrassment of having let those guns get away from him in the first place. So General Gage drafted orders for Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, and the top item he wanted his regulars to look for was 4 brass cannon and 2 mortars or cohorns in the cellar or outhouses of Mr. Barrett, a little on the other side of the bridge. Already, however, the Barretts had started moving their supplies to neighboring towns. Colonel Barrett's grandson James, then 14 years old, recalled how he and other boys, with oxen and cart, removed the stores deposited at the house of his grandfather into the woods and concealed them, a cartload in one place under pine boughs. And to speed the movement, the grandson said in 1848, the lads would march on each side of the oxen and goad them into a trot. So if you were on the Concord-Acton border in the middle of April 1775, you might see these oxen trotting down the road with a wagon full of something under the hay. On April 18th, the Massachusetts Committee of Safety was busy making new plans to store its supplies. It assigned pairs of artillery pieces to different towns, and among those towns was Acton. Acton was supposed to receive 2 mortars, which its militia company would be able to train on and then go to war with. And I'm not sure those weapons were ever moved to Acton, even though that shows the town was part of this military buildup, but they were assigned on April 18th, and then things got busy. Even as the Committee of Safety made its plan, General Gage was about to move. This time he took steps to make sure that patriots could not send out alarm messengers. He had mounted Army officers ride out on April 18th to patrol the roads between Charlestown and Concord. Ironically, those riders ended up alerting many locals that something was up because they were seeing strangers riding into town with military cloaks on and possibly spotting even their pistols. And in Lexington, militiamen saw those officers and started to gather. After sunset on April 18, 1775, about 800 British soldiers rode quietly across the Charles River. And it was more than twice as many men as went to Charlestown in September 1774 or Salem in February 1775. They were headed to Concord, but they were too late to catch Massachusetts' cannon. And on the road to Concord, those British soldiers would come across the Lexington Militia Company, all riled up about the officers in their town, lined up on the common, and there would be shooting. And this time, unlike up in New Hampshire, unlike in Salem, unlike in Charlestown, some of those shots would be fatal. Local men died. And later that day, there was another fatal confrontation at Concord's North Bridge, and men on both sides died, including 2 British soldiers and 3 men from Acton. And by the end of the afternoon, the Massachusetts militia regiments were converging on Boston again, and the war had begun. That was what brought about the Revolutionary War, the story that we know, but underneath that story were these months of tension and maneuvers and efforts to try to solve the political situation, but also to build up the military solution. And that is how we went to war. Thank you. Now, you may wonder about the cannon that were out there. 2 of them actually survive. 2 of those 4 cannon were returned to the state government by the federal government. They were used in the war, and one of them is now on display in the North Bridge Visitor Center of Minuteman National Historical Park, and the other is on display in the, it was hung at Bunker Hill Monument for decades and decades, but it is now conserved and on display at the, in the building at the lodge at the bottom of the monument, so you don't have to climb up all the steps to see it. And those are the actual cannon that General Gage wanted to find at Barrett's farm in April 1775, now back in Boston. So thank you very much. And I'll be happy to take questions, and I understand that there might be questions as well from...
We also have some on Zoom. Do you have one over there? Okay.
Okay. Let's see, let's start with Bill. Bill's asking how large is an 18-pound ball? It's dangerous. It's a 3-pound ball. These cannon were 3-pounders, and that's this size. 18 pounds is more like it's going to take your head off. And a cannon, when the provincials started the war, their heaviest cannon was 36-pounder. So they had heavy cannon, they had siege guns. They didn't have enough of them, which is why Henry Knox went out to Lake Champlain to bring back more, but they did not go to war with no cannon at all.
Jay, thank you very much. Can you just clarify the 4 cannons then that were at Barrett's farm, were all 4 of them removed before the British contingent got there?
That's right.
Okay, so none were at the farm when they...
None were at the farm. In fact, when the British troops arrived there, all that they found that was of military material were some cannon carriage wheels, which they burned. According to the family, they had barrels up in the attic of bullets, but they threw feathers on top, so it looked just like a barrel of feathers. They went out to the field and laid muskets in the ground and then had plowed dirt over the muskets. Those are later stories, and there are these stories of removing the cannon and other things from the farm as quickly as possible. I think that these cannon would have been the first to go because they were the most valuable and they were the most incriminating.
And is it known where the 4 cannons went from Barrett's farm?
I believe there is another rumor in Stowe that 4 cannon were taken to the field across from the house of Henry Gardner, who was the Provincial Congress's receiver general, the equivalent of the treasurer of this rebel government. And I think they were saying, okay, he can take care of the money, he can take care of the cannon. And I think that's where those 4 cannon went. But they weren't keeping careful records. You don't keep records on a criminal conspiracy.
Bill, Bill Clower, did you have a question?
Actually, I did.
No, there.
Thank you. Out of these, if you look at all of these cannon, is there any identifying marks on them to tell you something about that you could identify one from another?
That's a very good question. Were the cannons marked in some way? And Actually, it is very hard to track individual cannon, I've discovered, because there wasn't really a systematic marking. The reason we know that these cannon were involved was that when Henry Knox, as Secretary of War, sent them back from the federal government to Massachusetts, he took the time to have them engraved with the story on them. One is labeled the Adams, the other is labeled the Hancock, and there's a story that says these two cannon were half of the entire artillery force when the war started, which is a lie. Because, as I said, they had many more cannon. These were maybe half of these were the only brass cannon they had, but it made it more important, especially what made what Henry Knox had done more important, if they said these were only half the cannon. But once these two cannon were engraved, and that engraving was mentioned in the newspapers in the 1780s, it became absolutely easy to identify them to this present day, because no other cannon had that particular marking. Usually, a really organized artillery force like the Royal Artillery would have markings and numbers, and they would know exactly where each gun was. It's really hard to do that in the Continental Army, and especially this very early provincial force. They just weren't organized enough to do that.
I have two questions on Zoom. The first is, we always hear the gathering of militia as a reaction to the real or perceived British activity. Was there any mobilization or reaction by sailors, seamen, Marblehead, Newport, in reaction to British activity? And if so, what kind of activities occurred? Okay,
the question was, there was some militia uprising in reaction to British land maneuvers, basically. Did anything happen on the sea side? Yes, there are examples. There is at one point, for instance, there was a ship seized in Marblehead Harbor, and a local troop under a man named Samuel Trevitt went out and got that ship back, the little boat back from the Royal Navy ships. The sea, there were more loyalists actually in the seaports than there were in the countryside at this point. So in fact, there was more political division in those harbors, and there would not have been such a unified action, but the people who were committed to the Patriot cause did indeed take actions. And of course, if you lived in Marblehead, you were part of the militia. And Marblehead and Salem and these other towns had militia companies which mobilized on April 18th and 19th and came marching down towards where the British were. So they were part of the land mobilization.
The second question is, was any analysis ever done on the mysterious local spy who told Gage about the brass cannons and who it might have been? And the question says, I think you may have mentioned potential suspects in your book.
I tried when I wrote my book to figure that out, and I was just not able to do it. Since then, I have narrowed my sights down on a particular merchant who came out to Boston, came out from Boston when he married a rich woman in Concord. And he was known, A, for having hosted British officers at dinner in Concord, and B, his son in Boston had sold some cannon which belonged to the family to the Patriots. And those iron cannon had been moved out into the countryside and were distributed in Watertown, Weston, Waltham, and Concord, I believe. So he had a personal stake. As his son told him, I sold these cannon, and he was like, I didn't want to sell these cannon. But he sort of might have had a personal stake, this man, this merchant, in the cannon that his Concord neighbors, his new Concord neighbors, were collecting. So he is my top suspect. What I need to do is I need to find a handwriting sampling of him and compare it to the handwriting sampling in these terrible French letters and see if it's the same man. I'm not going to give his name because I don't want to slander him in case I'm wrong, but if you ask me quietly, I'll be happy to tell his name.
We have one back here.
I have a question on the difference between the brass cannon and the iron cannon. It sounds as though the brass cannon was more effective as a cannon, or what made it more valuable?
Brass cannons were better than cast iron cannons for a couple of reasons. One, well, I don't know if this really mattered, but they were shiny. I mean, you paraded with that, you looked good. That's one. Second, they were lighter. The cast iron cannon were heavy things, so that they were harder to maneuver around a battlefield. And the third is that if a cast iron cannon blew up, it became shrapnel, and it took out the gun crew. Whereas if a brass cannon burst, it would burst in just one area, like what happened with this one. And people it was not as dangerous. So for all those reasons, brass cannons were more desirable than cast iron cannons. They were also much more rare. As far as I can tell, these four that were stolen from Boston were the only brass cannon that the Americans had, the Massachusetts force had at the start of the war. And that was another reason why they were sort of incriminating if anyone caught them, because there weren't any others you could claim that they were.
And one more back here.
I'm curious about where you find these primary source materials. You're going to go look and compare the handwriting. Where the heck do you find these letters with the handwriting?
That's a good question. Where are the primary source materials? Well, General Gage, when he was relieved as governor of Massachusetts later in 1775, he took all his trunks of papers home to his family castle, well, family mansion, his estate in Britain. They stayed there for over 100 years, and then a rich American industrialist named Clements came along, William Clements, and he bought all the chests and had them moved to a new library he had built in Ann Arbor, Michigan, on the campus of the University of Michigan. And he did this with a number of other British and some American families too. So there's an absolutely amazing library in Ann Arbor of revolutionary materials. And that is where I've looked at the actual pieces of paper with terrible French and other things on it, and saying what is in Concord. Another very neat source that I like for this is at the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston, there is a little green notebook about this size, held together now with thread and pins, and that is the notebook that David Mason of Salem kept his notes on the cannon that he was collecting for the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. And he took notes on the dimensions of these cannon. And I was able to use those notes and go to these guns when they were in National Park Service custody and measure them and say, oh yes, these weird cannon, which are 46 inches long, it's not a standard measurement. Well, David Mason is writing in his notebook about two brass cannon 46 inches long. So they must be the same ones. Bob, up front. Yeah, here comes Bob.
I see this as a field piece,
Yes.
mounted on a carriage and easily maneuverable through the field by the gun crews. The cannon that Henry Knox took from Fort Ty and brought the bullets were fort cannons. And we had cannons out on, Acton Common underneath or in front of the Daves Memorial, and they have like an 8-inch barrel. Those look like ship cannons. So, I can't imagine they would maneuver those on the battlefield or have a carriage big enough to handle fort cannons.
Yes, these field pieces, they were small, but they were deadly because you could maneuver them more easily around the battlefield. The other thing is that these, because they were small, they were really used for training. This is a militia training weapon. And on the battlefield, the standard for the Royal Artillery was a 4-pounder or a 6-pounder. So these were even a little small for the standard Army size. You're quite right that if you got a 36-pounder, 24-pounder, those are much harder to move around on a battlefield, but you want them for the siege of Boston. And that's why, after all this trouble of moving these cannon and putting them on the ox carts and being worried about the spies coming and so on, then when the war started and the British were inside Boston and the provincials were ringed around the harbor at a distance.
That's where they built their readouts and put those big heavy cannons.
Yeah.
They were aimed, not maneuverable, they were mounted.
They were mounted. Now, at Bunker Hill, the provincial artillery was supposed to go on the field with 4-pounders. And there were 4 squads, 4 companies that were ordered onto the field. 1 company never got there. 3 got on there, 1 left immediately, the other left shortly afterwards, and the one man who stayed through the battle firing cannon was Samuel Trevitt, the same guy who went after that ship in Marblehead Harbor. And as he came off the field, General Putnam, who had seen military artillery officers leave and was furious about this, he accused Putnam of being a coward as well. And so Putnam was actually put under arrest for court-martial for a few hours before this was figured out. And so he went home. He thought, yeah, I'm not taking, these people don't respect me. So he went back to Marblehead. So the one man who actually kept up the artillery on the provincial side during the Battle of Bunker Hill left.
So the tie cannons weren't used at Bunker Hill then?
No.
When Henry Knox brought those cannons in, they were
tie-
used to fortify Dorchester Heights, and that's
Yes.
why the fleet evacuated Boston Harbor.
Let's see, the war started April 1775. In May 1775, the provincials got some more cannon by when a British naval warship ran aground. They also, New Hampshire sent some.
And these are
Rhode
ship
Island sent
cannons
some.
now.
These are ship cannons.
And those are huge.
This was a smaller ship, so they weren't huge, but they were large. But the Americans just didn't have enough gunpowder to use these things. Then Henry Knox came in January and February 1776. So months later, he arrived with about double the number of cannon, or to double the number of cannon the Continental Army already had.
And these were the fort
And
cannons.
some of them went up. These were from the forts along Lake Champlain.
Yeah.
He and John Adams left detailed inventories of exactly how many there were. They were on the heavy side, but there were also some small ones. These were put up on Dorchester Heights at the Roxbury Fort and fortified places in Cambridge. So they were ringing the harbor, and the big cannon up on Dorchester Heights were strong enough to
reach the
threaten
fleet in the harbor.
the ships in the harbor. And so once the British saw that, they thought, well, if we leave and they're firing at us, that won't be good. If we're waiting inside here and they're firing at our supply ships, that won't be good. We wanted to leave anyway, let's do it now. And so within 2 weeks of seeing those cannon up on Dorchester Heights, the British were gone.
Now, was it true there wasn't really enough gunpowder to use those cannons, so they never actually fired them?
They did fire some, but the Americans were always low on gunpowder, but by that point they had amassed enough.
Okay.
Anything else? Any other questions? Okay.
Got one right here, but
Okay.
before we do, can we look around the room a moment and remember that against the back wall on the table, there is a great deal of material about this year's April 19th. Please pick up some of that. Up here, we have merchandise, and we had the 50 pins available. And here we have a selection of the books that you will take care of and might be signed, perhaps.
I'd be happy to.
Right. And Dean, you have...
Yeah, just one clarification. There was some mention about the cannons next to the Isaac Davis Monument out front. Those are actual Civil War vintage Parrott rifles. And some years ago, when I was employed by the town, I was contacted by the Department of Defense and had to certify that we still had them and we still needed them. So they'll stay there for quite a while.
Thank you.
On that note, may we all thank our speaker. And for all of the students, you are going to come right down here for a picture. And perhaps those of us who wonder about the person in Concord might stand behind you and hear something. Thank you for coming.